You've all felt it, that exhaustion after spending time with certain people. It's like they didn't just borrow your time, they took your energy too. You walk away mentally tired, emotionally depleted, maybe even physically drained. Why does this happen? Some people simply drain us, and today we're going to unpack why. First, it's important to know that your energy is a limited resource. You don't owe it to everyone. And more often than not, the people who drain us aren't doing it on purpose. It's about patterns, habits, and sometimes our own boundaries. Energy is a limited resource. Not everyone deserves access to yours. That might sound selfish at first, especially if you've been raised to always be kind, always give people the benefit of the doubt, or always be there for others. But the truth is, your time and energy aren't infinite. You wake up every day with a certain emotional, mental, and physical capacity, and every interaction you have, every conversation, every moment of emotional labor, it chips away at that reserve. When you give too much of yourself to people who don't reciprocate, don't respect your boundaries, or constantly take without giving back, you start to notice the toll. You feel more tired, less focused, maybe more irritable. It starts subtly. Skipping things you enjoy because you're too drained, feeling anxious when your phone rings, or dreading interactions that once felt neutral. That's not a coincidence. That's your body and mind reacting to the imbalance. What makes this harder is that draining people don't always look like villains. Sometimes they're people you care about, people who are struggling, or people who genuinely don't realize the weight they're placing on you. But just because their intentions aren't malicious doesn't mean the impact isn't real. Being there for others is admirable, but not at the expense of yourself. You have the right to be intentional about where your energy goes. Not everyone has earned the right to that kind of access. And when you begin to recognize that your energy is something valuable, something that deserves to be protected, everything starts to shift. You become more aware of who fills your cup and who empties it. You begin to notice how you feel after spending time with someone, not just during. And most importantly, you learn that protecting your energy isn't rude. It's necessary. Emotionally needy people often offload their problems onto others, leaving you drained. These are the individuals who don't just seek support, they expect you to carry their emotional baggage for them. Every conversation becomes a deep dive into their personal struggles, crises, and feelings, often without any consideration for how it affects you. You could be having a rough day yourself, but the moment they show up, it's like your own emotions have to take a back seat. They need to talk, they need to vent, they need reassurance, and it all comes with the unspoken expectation that you'll be available to listen, comfort, and help them regulate their emotions every single time. You become their emotional outlet, sometimes their therapist, and often their crutch. What makes this dynamic especially draining is that there's rarely any balance. You'll notice that when the tables turn, when you need someone to lean on, they're either unavailable, uninterested, or they quickly shift the conversation back to themselves. It's not that they're evil or intentionally selfish, but they've become so accustomed to seeking emotional relief from others that they never learn to manage it themselves. Over time, being around someone like this can feel like you're in a one-way relationship. You begin to anticipate their emotional needs before your own, and eventually you might even start to feel guilty for wanting space or setting boundaries. The most exhausting part is how subtle it can be. These people often come off as vulnerable, which makes it hard to turn away or say no. You might convince yourself they need you, or that being a good friend means always being available, but the cost of constantly absorbing someone else's emotions is that you don't have enough room to feel and process your own. You walk away from interactions feeling heavier, like you've taken on more than you can carry, and you have. Emotional support should be mutual. When it becomes one-sided, it stops being support and starts becoming emotional labor, and that's when it crosses the line into being draining. Constant complainers and negative outlooks can weigh down your own mental state. These are the people who seem to find a problem for every solution. No matter what's going well in their life, in your life, in the world around them, they somehow manage to zero in on what's wrong. Conversations with them rarely feel uplifting. You might start by sharing something exciting or lighthearted, only for it to be met with cynicism, criticism, or a story about how something similar went horribly wrong for them. Over time, this negativity becomes a pattern, and it starts to affect how you see things too. What makes this energy so contagious is that the human brain naturally mirrors emotional states. Spending too much time around someone who constantly complains can shift your mindset from optimistic to skeptical, from hopeful to cautious. You might not even realize it's happening at first, but suddenly you notice yourself feeling less motivated, more irritable, and more inclined to expect disappointment rather than joy. It's like their negativity slowly becomes the filter through which you view your own life. It's mentally exhausting to keep trying to uplift someone who refuses to be lifted, to keep offering silver linings to someone who's always focused on the storm. And it's not just what they say, it's how they say it. Their energy often carries a heaviness, a kind of emotional weight that hangs in the air long after the conversation ends. They might not be yelling or visibly upset, but there's a constant undertone of dissatisfaction with their job, their relationships, the weather, the government, even the food they eat. When you're around them, it can feel like you're constantly being pulled into their personal cloud of gloom, no matter how hard you try to stay in the sun. Eventually, you find yourself emotionally bracing before every conversation because you already know what's coming. You begin to withhold good news or joyful experiences, not because you don't want to share them, but because you know they'll be met with complaints, warnings, or negativity. And that's when it becomes clear their outlook isn't just draining, it's starting to shape your own. Protecting your peace doesn't mean you're turning your back on someone. It means recognizing that consistent exposure to negativity will quietly erode your own sense of joy and balance. Attention seekers dominate conversations and connections, leaving little space for mutual exchange. These are the people who constantly need to be seen, heard, and validated, not occasionally, but as a baseline requirement in every interaction. Whether they're telling a story, reacting to yours, or simply existing in a social space, the spotlight has to be on them. At first, it might seem harmless or even entertaining. They're often charismatic, animated, and quick to grab attention. But over time, you start to notice that the dynamic is one-sided. You're not really engaging in a back and forth, you're sitting in the audience while they perform. These individuals often hijack conversations, shifting the focus back to themselves no matter what the topic is. You could be sharing something meaningful or vulnerable, and they'll find a way to make it about their own experience, often with a story that's bigger, more dramatic, or somehow more important. If the attention drifts away from them, even for a moment, you'll see subtle or overt ways they try to reclaim it, interrupting, changing the subject, or exaggerating their emotions. It becomes clear that their need to be at the center isn't just occasional, it's constant. The emotional drain here doesn't come from loudness or drama alone, but from the lack of connection. You start to realize that your role in their world is to reflect and affirm, not to relate and connect. You're not two people sharing space, you're one person orbiting the other. Over time, this kind of dynamic can chip away at your self-worth. You might begin to feel invisible in the relationship, like your thoughts, feelings, and needs are secondary, or even irrelevant. And even when you try to speak up or redirect the conversation, their need for validation overshadows everything else. This type of energy can also create an underlying tension. You start to censor yourself, avoid certain topics, or limit your emotional expression because deep down you know it will either be ignored or outdone. The relationship becomes less about connection and more about maintenance, keeping them satisfied, keeping the peace, keeping them feeling important, and that emotional balancing act is exhausting. True connection is built on mutual presence. When one person takes up all the air in the room, the other person suffocates. And that's exactly what it feels like to be in the company of someone who constantly demands attention without offering any in return. Listen to your body and protect your peace. Boundaries are essential to maintaining your energy. Sometimes you don't even need a dramatic moment to realize something's off. It shows up in the little things, the way your stomach knots when a certain name pops up on your phone, the sigh you let out before answering a message, or the heaviness you feel after a simple interaction. Your body often knows before your mind catches up. That sense of dread, tension, or emotional fatigue isn't random. It's your system trying to alert you that your boundaries are being pushed, ignored, or simply not respected. When you constantly override those feelings, when you keep showing up, keep saying yes, keep absorbing energy that's not yours to hold, you start to operate from a place of depletion. That's when burnout creeps in. Not the kind that comes from work or life stress, but the quiet, soul-level burnout that comes from being emotionally overextended. It doesn't happen all at once, it's a slow erosion of your peace, and the people who drain you are often the ones who don't recognize your limits, or worse, who take advantage of your tendency to give without asking for anything in return. Setting boundaries can feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you're someone who's used to being available, supportive, and easygoing. You might worry about hurting feelings, creating conflict, or being seen as selfish. But the reality is, boundaries aren't about shutting people out, they're about making sure that the way others interact with you is sustainable and respectful. You have a right to say, "I can't talk right now, this is too much for me," or "I need some space." And you don't need to explain yourself to everyone who questions it. Your peace doesn't need to be justified. When you start protecting your energy with intention, something powerful happens. You begin to notice who respects those boundaries and who pushes against them. You start to see which relationships are reciprocal and which ones are dependent on you overextending yourself. And in that awareness, you gain clarity, not just about others, but about yourself. You realize you don't have to feel guilty for not always being available. You don't have to sacrifice your well-being for the sake of keeping the peace, because your peace is the priority. And sometimes preserving it means walking away from people or situations that repeatedly cost you more than you can afford to give. Not all draining relationships are loud or obvious. Some are subtle, quiet, and built on guilt. These are the interactions where nothing is said outright, but everything is felt. It's the friend who never directly asks for help, but always hints that they're struggling in ways that make you feel responsible. It's the family member who doesn't demand your time, but makes you feel selfish when you set boundaries. These kinds of dynamics often fly under the radar because they're not confrontational. They're manipulative in a soft, almost invisible way. You might not even realize you're being drained, because on the surface, things look fine. The person isn't yelling, they're not dumping their problems in a dramatic way, and they're not openly disrespecting your boundaries. But underneath that surface, there's a current of emotional pressure. You feel it in the way you second-guess your decisions, the way you rehearse your words before saying no, or the way you feel anxious after spending time with them even though nothing bad happened. These are signs of emotional entanglement, when someone is so quietly dependent on your emotional availability that you feel guilty for having needs of your own. This kind of drain is especially difficult to address because it plays on your empathy. You care and they know that. They don't have to ask directly, they just have to act a little disappointed, a little hurt, a little distant, and you feel compelled to fix it. It creates a loop where you're always adjusting yourself to keep them from feeling bad, even when it means compromising your own comfort. Over time, that kind of self-sacrifice becomes exhausting. You start to anticipate their needs before your own. You shrink your truth to avoid their disapproval, and eventually you lose clarity on where you end and they begin. Being drained in this way isn't always about obvious toxicity. Sometimes it's about emotional enmeshment, where the boundaries between you and someone else are so blurred that your well-being becomes tied to theirs. And that's when it gets dangerous. Because your ability to rest, reflect, or feel joy becomes contingent on someone else's emotional state. That's not compassion, that's codependency. Recognizing it requires a lot of honesty with yourself, and the willingness to believe that you're allowed to protect your energy, even when the other person isn't obviously harmful. Even quiet drains can do serious damage over time. And the first step in reclaiming your energy is giving yourself permission to feel what you feel, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it goes against how you've been taught to love. Some people drain you because they refuse to grow, and staying connected to them keeps you stuck. These are the people who live in cycles, same problems, same complaints, same patterns over and over again. They talk about change, they might even cry about it, but they don't do anything different. Every time you meet them with patience, encouragement, or solutions, it's like pouring water into a cup with no bottom. It disappears, but nothing fills. You start to feel like a broken record, offering the same advice, watching the same story unfold, only to end up right where it started. Being close to someone who resists growth is one of the most frustrating and exhausting emotional experiences. Because on one level, you want to believe in them. You see their potential. You care about them. You know what they could be if they just took one step forward. But wanting more for someone than they want for themselves creates a deep, ongoing imbalance. You become the motivator, the emotional caretaker, the one carrying the vision, while they sit still, sometimes passively, sometimes defiantly. Over time, it begins to take a toll on your spirit. You start to feel like their stagnation is holding you back from your own growth. And it is. What makes this dynamic especially draining is that it often comes with emotional guilt. You might think they've been through so much, or they just need time, or worse, maybe I haven't done enough. But the truth is, personal growth is not something you can do for someone else. You can support it, you can inspire it, but you cannot create it in someone who isn't willing to participate. And when you keep tying yourself to people who won't grow, you end up spending your energy fighting battles that aren't yours, while your own development, your own peace, your own goals get pushed aside. Eventually, you might notice that your life feels smaller around them. You find yourself censoring your wins, downplaying your progress, or avoiding conversations about your future because you know it will make them feel insecure, defensive, or left behind. That's when the cost of the connection becomes undeniable. Being loyal to someone who won't grow is not a virtue, it's a sacrifice. And while compassion is powerful, it should never come at the expense of your own evolution. You can love someone and still outgrow the space you once shared with them. And when that happens, the most loving thing you can do, for both of you, is to keep growing anyway. Some people drain you because their presence constantly puts you on edge. You never quite feel emotionally safe around them. It's not always about what they do overtly. Sometimes it's the subtle tension they bring into the room, the way their energy shifts the atmosphere, the way your guard goes up the second they walk in. You find yourself carefully choosing your words, managing your tone, and double-checking how you express yourself, not because you're being thoughtful, but because you're afraid of being judged, misunderstood, or dismissed. That kind of emotional vigilance is exhausting. You're not just having a conversation, you're performing emotional self-defense. These are the people who make you feel like you're walking on eggshells. Maybe they're quick to take offense, easily irritated, passive-aggressive, or unpredictable in how they'll respond to even the most harmless interaction. You never really know what version of them you're going to get. So you end up shrinking, softening, or editing yourself just to avoid triggering something you didn't even realize was an issue. And that's the trap. The more you shrink, the more power they gain. You begin to feel like you can't relax, like you can't be fully yourself, like every interaction has stakes that shouldn't be there in the first place. The mental toll of this kind of dynamic is incredibly draining. You might walk away from a simple conversation feeling like you ran a marathon, not because it was long or heated, but because you were hyper-aware of everything the entire time. You were reading between lines, analyzing tone, measuring responses. Over time, this emotional hypervigilance becomes your default when they're around, and it slowly bleeds into other areas of your life. You start questioning your instincts, doubting your reactions, even blaming yourself for feeling uncomfortable in the first place. What makes it worse is when these people are close, a partner, a friend, a coworker, or a family member, and the relationship carries unspoken expectations. Maybe you feel obligated to maintain peace, to keep them happy, to be the bigger person. But emotional safety isn't a luxury, it's a requirement for any relationship that's truly healthy. And when someone repeatedly creates an atmosphere where you can't be real, can't be relaxed, or can't be vulnerable without fear, they're not just difficult, they're draining. Their presence demands more than it gives. It takes your attention, your emotional flexibility, your sense of peace, and offers back a sense of instability that keeps you stuck in a loop of self-monitoring. Being around someone like this doesn't just wear down your energy, it chips away at your sense of self. And while they may not be outwardly aggressive or intentionally toxic, the emotional weight they bring is real. It changes how you show up. And any connection that forces you to constantly self-protect isn't a connection at all. It's a slow, invisible drain on your well-being. Some people drain you because they expect you to fix problems that aren't yours to solve. They come to you not just for support or advice, but with an unspoken expectation that you'll take responsibility for their decisions, their emotions, and sometimes even their lives. It starts small, a little help here, a favor there, but over time it turns into a pattern. You become their go-to for every crisis, every setback, every bad day, until your role in the relationship shifts from friend or partner to rescuer. And the hardest part is it's not always framed as dependency. Often it's disguised as trust. You're the only one I can count on. I knew you'd know what to do, or I didn't know who else to turn to. Those words might sound flattering, but they come with weight. That weight becomes heavier when you realize that no matter how much you do, it's never enough. You solve one problem, and another appears. You offer your time, and they want more of it. You set boundaries, and they push against them, because your support has become their habit. And if you ever try to step back or say no, the emotional response can feel manipulative, disappointment, guilt-tripping, or even anger. Suddenly you're not just helping them, you're responsible for how they feel about your help. That's the twist. They've made you accountable not just for what you do, but for what you don't do. Over time, this dynamic can create deep emotional exhaustion. You begin to internalize their problems as your own. Their stress becomes your stress. Their chaos becomes your background noise. And while you're pouring your energy into fixing their world, yours quietly begins to fall apart. You have less time for your goals, less clarity in your thoughts, and less emotional space to take care of yourself. You start to feel like you're carrying more than you signed up for, and you are. What's particularly draining about this kind of person is that they often resist real change. They want relief, not growth. They're not asking you to help them evolve. They're asking you to help them maintain the exact situation that keeps them stuck, with your time, your energy, your empathy. And the more you give, the more it reinforces the dynamic. You become the solution, and they become someone who doesn't need to take full responsibility for their own life, because they've outsourced that burden to you. This type of emotional labor is hard to recognize, because it can feel like love, friendship, or loyalty. But love doesn't mean carrying someone endlessly, especially when they have legs of their own. Support doesn't mean solving someone's problems for them. And loyalty doesn't mean self-sacrifice at the cost of your own well-being. People who constantly expect you to fix their lives may not be doing it maliciously, but that doesn't make it any less draining. Because at the end of the day, their peace is coming at the price of your exhaustion. Some people drain you because they're constantly in competition with you, even when you're not playing the game. These are the people who view everything, success, happiness, even healing, as a scoreboard. You share something good in your life, and instead of celebrating with you, they find a way to shift the spotlight. Maybe they immediately compare it to something they've done, subtly undermine it, or offer a backhanded compliment that leaves you questioning whether your joy is even valid. At first you might brush it off as insecurity, or just a quirk in their personality. But over time the pattern becomes clear. They don't feel connected unless they feel superior. And your wins, your growth, your peace, those things threaten their sense of control. It can be subtle. It's not always loud jealousy or open sabotage. Sometimes it's masked in humor, sarcasm, or friendly advice. You might say you're thinking about making a change, a new job, a new path, a new version of yourself, and they'll immediately list the reasons why it might not work, why it's risky, or why they would do it differently. They position themselves as wiser, more grounded, more experienced. And even though they don't say it outright, the message is clear. You're not quite enough unless they've approved of your direction. Being around someone like this creates an emotional drain, because it's not just your energy that gets questioned, it's your identity. You begin to second-guess your instincts, downplay your accomplishments, or keep certain things to yourself, just to avoid the awkward tension that follows every high point in your life. You start minimizing yourself in their presence, because you've learned that your light makes them uncomfortable. And in doing so, you start dimming the very parts of you that feel most alive. This kind of competition isn't rooted in ambition, it's rooted in scarcity. These individuals operate from a belief that someone else's success somehow subtracts from their own. So instead of being inspired, they feel threatened. Instead of being supportive, they become distant, critical, or cold. And if you're not careful, you begin to absorb that scarcity mindset. You start to believe that it's not safe to grow, not safe to shine, not safe to evolve, because the people closest to you might pull away or lash out when you do. Relationships like this chip away at your self-esteem slowly. You begin to equate connection with playing small. And it's draining because you're constantly negotiating between who you are and who you're allowed to be in their presence. You aren't competing with them, but they're always competing with you, and eventually that quiet, relentless push for dominance starts to feel like weight on your chest. Not because you're losing, but because you were never supposed to be in a race to begin with. You were just trying to be yourself.